to start our formal introduction. So again, my name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Urban Studies and director of the Center for Transportation Studies. And along with my colleagues, Chris Monsieur, John Glebe, and Rob Bertini, we help co-organize this seminar every Friday. And we welcome all of you in the room and anyone out there watching us on the web. And today I'm doing the introduction because I am the speaker today. And so there's the introduction. I'm going to be talking about some preliminary results from a research project I've been working on for a couple years and have a few more months to go. And this work, Kim Voros, a graduate student in urban and regional planning, has been working on this project with me. She's not here today because she's still at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting. I think we're flying back from it today, so she wasn't able to present here. So what I'm presenting today is a longer version of a paper I presented a few days ago at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting back in DC. So you'll get a longer version of it, but again, there's still, I want to emphasize initial survey findings here. So let's get started. And if we could sort of hold substantive questions to the end, but if there are clarifications and things like that, if you don't understand something, feel free to interrupt, and I'll answer those. So because this was in DC, if you notice, I had started with sort of this nice, beautiful picture of Portland that actually I borrowed from the BTA website, and how nice and beautiful it is in Portland, and we all know that it's like that year-round. But I wanted to, since we had that snow, I grabbed these pictures from the Bike Portland website because I thought they were great examples of how dedicated the cyclists in Portland were, and I sort of wanted to show the rest of the attendees at this conference that it does snow in Portland and people still ride their bikes, and I thought there were some great shots here. So as some background to this project, this is a research project that is funded by the Active Living Research Program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And those of you who are familiar with that organization, you know that they're concerned about health. And so this project is focusing on what factors influence people's decisions to bicycle, and in particular, how does the physical environment, the urban form of people's neighborhoods, the presence of bike lanes, things like that, how does that influence people's decision on whether or not to bicycle, with the idea that it's healthy if people bicycle more, they get more physical activity, they'll be healthier, and that we want people to bicycle more for those health reasons. So what can we do to change the urban environment to get them to bicycle more? But at the same time, we need to realize that there are a lot of other factors influencing people's decisions of whether or not to bicycle. A lot of demographics, their age, their health to begin with, things like that, their attitudes, their lifestyle, all sorts of things influence those decisions. So we need to take those into account as well. So a few caveats. And I want to emphasize, this is really a first cut analysis. You'll see we did a long survey with a lot of data, and I'm still crunching numbers, and even an hour ago I was creating some of the numbers to put in this presentation. There's a lot more to do with this data. There's still other things to do on the project that I'll talk about. So the conclusions are really preliminary. But I think there's some interesting things that we're finding, and I wanted to at least start sharing, and also to get some ideas of what other analysis might be useful to folks and interesting. I'm only presenting some of the findings. You'll see it was a very lengthy survey, so I can only touch on a few things today. So there's my caveats. So what did we do? So the first part of the project involved a random phone survey. We ended up with 566 adults. This was conducted primarily in November 2005. We were targeting adults living within the urban area of Portland, Oregon region, and that's just the Oregon side. And the reason we limit it to the Oregon side is because we needed to link all that data to land use information, and we have more information on the Oregon side than we do in Vancouver. So that's one reason we limited it that way. So the survey itself, like I said, it was quite lengthy. Some people were on the phone for a long time, but this is what we did. We started out with a screening after we got an adult on the house, adult who lived in the house on the phone. We asked if they were physically able to ride a bicycle. So we screened out anyone who wasn't physically able to ride a bicycle. Then we asked, how would you describe yourself as a cyclist? I never bicycle, I bicycle occasionally, or I bicycle regularly. So this was just their initial, what would they call themselves? And the reason we did that is because the people who never rode a bicycle, there were lots of things we're not going to ask them, like how often do you ride a bicycle, things like that. So the next two sections of the survey, one section asked about their bicycling behavior the past summer and during non-summer months. So we asked things like, during this past summer, June through September, on average, how many times did you ride your bike a month? How many times did you ride your bike to work per month? How many did you ride for going shopping per month? Things like that. And then other, when you do ride, you ride mainly on the street or on trails, all sorts of questions about their behavior in general. And then we asked them, think about the last day that you rode a bicycle from your home. And then we asked them a lot of questions about the trips that they actually rode their bicycle on, where they went, how long it took them, things like that. So you can imagine that there's up to 3 trips. So this could get, for people who biked a lot, it could get quite lengthy survey. So those questions we only asked of people who were occasional, who self-identified as occasional or regular cyclist. Then everyone, whether they cycled or not, we asked them a lot of questions about their experiences with bicycling. And when I say experiences, we ask questions like, did you ride your bike to school when you were a kid? When you were a kid, did you ride your bike other places besides school? Do other adults in your household ride a bike? Do people where you work ride a bike to work? Things like to get sort of the sort of social support aspects of cycling. We asked them questions about, do you feel your neighborhood is safe for bicycling? We asked how important was the bicycling environment in choosing where you're living, all sorts of questions like that. We also asked a whole series of questions about their attitudes towards all forms of mobility. And what I mean by that is, well, first of all, driving, transit, walking, and cycling. And simple questions like, agree or disagree, I like driving, I like riding a bike, or I think walking is safer than driving, I think bicycling is safer than driving. I think that we need to build more freeways in this region. A whole series of about 30 questions to try to get at people's attitudes. And the idea there is that people's attitudes, other research has shown, can be a significant factor in determining people's behavior, and sometimes can be as important as the physical environment. So we included those questions. And then, of course, sort of standard demographic questions of age and income and employment, education, those types of things, vehicle ownership. And then also we asked them where they lived. And we explained that we're trying to link behavior to neighborhood characteristics. And so we asked them for their actual address. And most of the respondents did give us their address. If they didn't give us their address, most people gave us a nearest intersection. So then what we were able to do is, geocode that information on a map so we know exactly where, or hopefully exactly where they live. Then we could develop with GIS, and this is a lot of the work that Kim has been doing, variables that describe the neighborhood. Okay, so the street connectivity, the bike lane mileage, those types of things. How close they were to a trail. So who responded? Who were these 566 people? And I'm going to show you just a couple comparisons of our respondents versus the census data from 2000. just to give you an idea. What we eventually can do is weight the data and the responses from the survey to try to represent the population. But I do want to make the point today of what I'm showing you is not necessarily representative of the population, because with any phone survey, you're not going to get certain types of people to respond as much as they exist in the world. And in particularly 18 to 24-year-olds are hard to get on phone surveys, because these are landline phones, not cell phones. Okay, and there's a high percentage of that population is cell phone only. So you can see here that our sample, just over 5% of our sample were 18 to 24-year-olds, but they are a much larger share of the population in this region as a whole. So there's a distribution. So we're a little skewed towards older adults than younger adults. This is showing income, and we actually didn't do too bad here in terms of income distribution. Slightly underrepresented in terms of the lowest income categories and a little overrepresented on the highest income categories, but not too bad. I was pretty happy with this. And again, eventually we can weight the data to try to more closely resemble the population. Just a few other pieces of information. 56% of our respondents were female, compares to 51% of the adult population in the region. 89% of our respondents were white, compared to 84% of the population. So we can't say a whole lot about non-white adults bicycling in the region. About half had college degrees, compared to 30% of the population. So our respondents are a bit more educated than the population. 34% had children in the household, which is right on with the census. So we got parents were definitely in our sample. And nearly all of the respondents had at least one motor vehicle in the household, and almost all of them were licensed to drive. So one of the first things we've done to do this analysis, and this again is something that we'll do some more work on, is we tried to categorize the cyclists as a way of analyzing the data. So the first set of categories I came up with was for covering sort of all types of cycling they might be doing. And we came up with these three categories to make it simple. One is something that we called non-cyclists. So those are the people who, on that one of those early questions that say, I never ride a bicycle. So they were put into this category. Then also in this category are people who may have responded to that first question, yes, I cycle occasionally. But then on subsequent questions, when we asked them, okay, well, how many times per month did you ride a bicycle this past summer? And they said 0. And then we said, well, how many times during the non-summer months did you ride a bicycle? And they say 0. We put them in that category of non-cyclists, because even though they said they ride occasionally, when we really asked them, they haven't been riding, at least not in the past year. So about half of our sample are non-cyclists. Then we have a category of what I'm calling here irregular cyclists. These are people who maybe only cycle during the summer months and not at all during the rest of the year, or they may cycle year-round but less than once a week. So they're not regular bicyclists. Then I have a category, and that was 30% of our sample, and then I have a category of regular year-round cyclists. So these are people who cycle once a week or so on average year-round. Now, what I want to emphasize here is those are the shares of our sample of respondents to this survey. So you can't go out and say half of people in the Portland region are non-cyclists, because our sample is not necessarily representative. So, but this describes our sample. So I want to make that point clear. And then we had another category, because we're particularly interested in people who bicycle for everyday activities. So going to work, going to school, going shopping, things like that. What we call utilitarian trips. So they're not just riding their bike in a loop on a trail or whatever to get exercise. They're actually going to get something done that most of the public uses a motorized vehicle to do. And so right now we just have a sort of a dummy variable of whether or not they made a utilitarian bike trip during the past summer. Okay, so fairly simple at this point, and this is one thing that we'll be doing as we analyze the data further, is coming up with different ways of describing these cyclists. But for today, those are our categories. So this map is showing where our respondents were distributed throughout the region. The darkest green are those regular cyclists. The medium green are the irregular cyclists, and the lightest green are non-cyclists. And the main point of this map is to show that we did get respondents from throughout the region. So we have a pretty good range. The gray is the urban growth boundary. We've got a few people outside the urban growth boundary, even though we had wanted to focus on inside, but you never know when you're calling people. So we've got a pretty good distribution throughout the region that we're pretty happy with. So what I'm going to talk about today or focus on, again, is sort of going back to those research questions. So looking at what are the differences in cycling behavior by those categories based on demographics, what I call objective measures of the environment, and what I mean there is something that we're measuring through GIS. Then secondly, perceptions of the environment, so what the respondent, how they describe their environment, because that's sometimes different than objective measures. And then finally, attitudes, those questions about how they feel about different modes and things like that. So first, going over some of the demographic findings. Now, some of these findings are very consistent with other surveys, either national surveys or local surveys, other regions. And in particular, there's definitely a relationship between age and cycling. And so on the far left, you have 18 to 34-year-olds. On the far right, you have 65 and older. And you can see as the adults got older, the likelihood that they were a regular cyclist went down, and the likelihood that they're a non-cyclist went up. That's not surprising and very consistent in the U.S. at least. That is a typical pattern. Then the bright green bars, and I'm using this coloring scheme several times, so you'll see it again. The bright green bars are whether or not they made a utilitarian trip in the past summer. There's something cut off there. But you can see, for example, 32% of the 18 to 34-year-olds made a utilitarian trip in the past summer, and that goes down to only 4% of the adults 65 and older had. So again, a clear relationship with age. Another finding that's consistent with other, at least U.S. patterns, is men were more likely to be regular cyclists than women. 27% of the men were regular cyclists compared to only 13% of the women surveyed. And that's consistent with other places as well, at least in the U.S. In this sample, cycling rates in terms of whether you're non-irregular or regular cyclist rose with income. So particularly people earning $100,000 or more were 30% of them were regular cyclists compared to only 17% of people with incomes under $35,000 a year. And this again is something particularly at where I was presenting this earlier in the week. There were definitely other surveys and other research in the U.S. that was showing some similar patterns, particularly over $100,000 a year in households as cycling more.
Is that individual income or
household income? But there is no significant relationship when we look at whether or not they made a utilitarian trip, and those are, again, the bright green bars. So sort of across the board, anywhere from 19 to 28% of the individuals made a utilitarian trip. So no relationship there in terms of income. No statistically significant pattern. And also, we didn't find any pattern with respect to vehicle availability. And like I said, virtually all of the respondents, there was at least one vehicle in the household, but we also looked at households that had more than one vehicle per adult versus less than one vehicle per adult, and that didn't seem to be driving the type of, or the amount of cycling they were doing either, at least measured this way. So now looking at some difference in cycling behavior by those objective measures of the environment. So one thing, and again, this is just some initial analysis. So one of our variables was whether or not they were within a quarter mile of a regional trail, meaning something like the Springwater Corridor Trail, the East Bank Esplanade, regional off-street trails. And you can see here that for our categories of non-irregular and regular cyclists, no big difference, but there actually was a difference in whether or not they made a utilitarian trip. So what this is saying is 1/3 or 33% of the respondents who lived within a quarter mile of a regional trail made a utilitarian trip within the past year versus only 21% of the people who lived beyond a quarter mile of a trail. The next thing we looked at was bike lane density. And so this is miles, linear miles of bike lanes per square mile within a quarter mile circle of the person's home. And here we actually found no relationship between bike lane density and whether or not the person was a regular cyclist or not, or whether or not they made a utilitarian trip. No significant differences between the lowest density group, which was having no bike lanes, and the highest density, which was at least 2.3 miles per square mile of bike lane density. This was a little surprising because I've done other research using census data, and so has Mauricio actually in a project that he did here a few years ago that did show a correlation between bike lane density and bicycle commuting. And so this is one of those findings where it's, what does this mean? Does it mean that there really isn't a relationship, or maybe there's a relationship and we're just not measuring it yet? And so this is one place where we're going to do some additional analysis and see if we either measure bike lane in a different way. For example, if we come up with a measure of the connectivity of the bike lane network, sort of the quality of the bike lane network, is that affecting people cycling? Or is it a matter of location? Or are our dependent variables not capturing something? So again, this is something I'm not ready to say I'm definitely not ready to say bike lanes don't matter. I'm saying we need to dig into the data a little further to come up with a conclusion. We did find a relationship, though, between street connectivity and amounts of levels of bicycling. And so a really well-connected street system would be a grid system where you can easily get from point A to point B a number of different ways and probably a pretty direct route, as opposed to an unconnected street system with a lot of dead ends and long blocks and things like that. So we divided our respondents into 4 groups based on the level of connectivity. And this is the least connected on the left and the most connected on the right. And here you do see a pattern that there's higher levels of cycling where the street connectivity is higher. And particularly in this last group, you see a pretty big increase in terms of whether or not they made a utilitarian cycling trip. One of the things here that we'll have to do an analysis, obviously, when you think about the Portland region, the places where there's a really well-connected street pattern, the inner east side of the city of Portland where it's very gridded, that also correlates with a lot of other things, being close to downtown, which we also found to be a significant factor on levels of cycling, a mix of land uses, and things like that. So this is sort of the next step in the analysis is also to do some multivariate modeling to try to figure out the relative significance of these different factors. And then just to show you sort of spatially what's going on here, and this is again sort of some more analysis. Hopefully we can employ some fun spatial statistics on this data. The blue dots are people who made a utilitarian cycling trip, And the orange dots are people who are bicyclists, but they didn't make a utilitarian cycling trip in the past summer. And so, at least when you look at this map, you do see, if you're thinking what share of all the dots are blue versus the yellow or orange, you do see a bit more of a concentration here as opposed to areas like this where all the cyclists in our sample, we are not at this point categorizing them as utilitarian cyclists. And again, definitely an area where we'll be doing some more analysis. But you do see some folks, in places that you don't think about as maybe being very cycle-friendly, who are cycling for utilitarian reasons. So next, perceptions of the environment. We asked, because one of the reasons we did both the objective measures and perceptions of the environment, because in often cases it's people's perceptions that is really the important thing. There may be a bike lane nearby, but if they don't think there is, then that is probably what's influencing their decision or not. So we asked a series of questions about their environment. I'm just going to show a few things here. And so, for example, at the top, one of the statements was, there are quiet streets in my neighborhood without bike lanes that connect to places I need to get to. So that was trying to get at this concept of bicycle boulevards, which the city of Portland is really looking into. So of the people who agreed with that statement, who said, yes, there are quiet streets in my neighborhood, 23% of those people were regular cyclists. Of the people who disagreed with that statement, only 12% of them were regular cyclists. Okay, so need to be clear there. On the next one, there are bike lanes in my neighborhood that connect to places I need to get to. So the people who agreed with that statement, 26% were regular cyclists. But the people who disagreed, 16% were regular cyclists. So we are seeing a relationship between people's perceptions and how they think of their neighborhood with respect to cycling infrastructure and whether or not they're a regular cyclist. Now the question then is, well, what's the direction of that relationship? Is the fact that they think that and they're aware of what's in their neighborhood, is that getting them to cycle more? Or is the fact that they are a cyclist, then they know what's in their neighborhood in terms of an environment and it's going in the other direction? So this was on the percent who were regular cyclists, and we saw similar relationships between whether or not they rode for a utilitarian purpose. So of those people who agreed about having the quiet streets in their neighborhood, 27% of them made a utilitarian trip. Of the people who disagreed with that, only 10% of them made a utilitarian trip. So definitely saw a larger difference, a more significant relationship there. A couple other things I wanted to point out. Those were just 3 questions. We had a series of about 10 questions or so about perceptions of the environment, and I just pulled those out to highlight. A few other things that came out that were sort of differences between whether or not people were regular cyclists or utilitarian cyclists I thought was interesting. The perceptions about the amount of traffic on nearby streets, not the person's own street, was a significant factor in the level of utilitarian cycling, but not regular cycling. Okay, and one way that I'm thinking about this, one possible interpretation, is that some of those people who are regular cyclists are not necessarily cycling in their neighborhood. They're taking their bike out on a trail somewhere, they're driving somewhere to bicycle. The utilitarian cyclists are bicycling more in their neighborhood. And so that's why traffic on nearby streets is perhaps influencing their behavior. That's just one interpretation of that finding. And then also, people who agreed that bicyclists on the streets in my neighborhood can easily be seen by people in their homes were more likely to be utilitarian cyclists, and no difference in terms of being a regular cyclist. And we asked that question because we wanted to know sort of if there's sort of almost the eyes on the street concept If people can be seen, do people feel, is it sort of a safer cycling environment, and would that influence behavior? So then some of the differences we found in terms of those attitudes towards mobility. A lot of the findings on this were pretty obvious. You know, we had, and I should explain that this list of about 30 different statements that we asked people whether they agreed or disagreed with. This was a list of statements that was developed by some researchers down at UC Davis, and it's something that I've been using in other surveys I'm doing, like on people who live in transit-oriented developments. And so it's a list that was designed for a general population. It wasn't just about bicycling. And so there are statements on there like, I like bicycling. Well, of course, people who agreed that I like bicycling were more likely to be cyclists. So there's a lot of findings on the individual questions that were not that surprising. What we will be doing is taking that whole list and doing a factor analysis or some other technique to try to categorize people. But there were a few things, there was one thing in particular that I thought was interesting, where there were some differences between the likelihood of being a regular cyclist versus the likelihood of being a utilitarian cyclist. There were three of the statements in particular. There's a difference here. There's a statement, I like driving. Statement, my household spends too much money on owning and driving our cars. And the statement, vehicles should be taxed on the basis of the amount of pollution they produce. So you can imagine if someone is sort of anti-car, to sort of put a label on it, they would probably disagree with the first statement and agree with the next two statements. And what we found is that people who were in that category, saying they disagreed about liking driving and they agreed with those other statements, were more likely to be utilitarian cyclists. But there was no difference. They were equally likely to be regular cyclists. And so I know that can be a little confusing. Basically, how I'm interpreting that is that some anti-car attitudes are linked more with utilitarian cycling, but not necessarily cycling overall. Okay. And this, again, is something that we'll probably want to dig into a bit more, because from a policy perspective, if we're interested in getting people to bicycle more, one area we should be looking at are people who are maybe purely recreational cyclists. So, I mean, those people who in the beginning said, I never ride a bicycle, trying to get them to start riding a bicycle to work is probably going to be pretty difficult. But the people who ride regularly on the Springwater Corridor Trail for exercise, for example, that's maybe the group that, given the right neighborhood, the right environment, if they felt safe enough, they're the ones who maybe you could get to start cycling to work or to other trip purposes. And so that's one of the things that we need to, if we want more people to be utilitarian cyclists, understanding the attitudes that are currently driving that versus the attitudes of cyclists in general can be useful. And then just some additional results, because like I think I've emphasized, there were a lot of questions on this survey. There's a lot of interesting data. We also asked a question, to agree or disagree, I would like to bicycle more. And most people said, yeah, I'd like to bicycle more. Even the people who didn't bicycle, there seemed to be some interest in cycling more. Whether or not they really would is another question. But of the people who said that they would like to travel by bicycle more, these are the barriers that they, barriers that they identified to why they are not bicycling more. And the number one there, and these were, we gave them these. These were not open-ended questions. So these were the ones that we developed and asked them, is this a barrier or not? And so have too much traffic. 56% of the people who do want to cycle more said that was a barrier to them cycling more. And that was definitely the number one answer, followed by no bike lanes or bike trails, no safe places to bike nearby, too many hills on down the line to no interesting places to bike to, which is sort of nice. nice to know that there are places people want to bike to, but maybe there's too much traffic is something that's preventing them. Now, what we don't know, I mean, this is just people saying. I mean, we don't know. This is their stated preference. We don't know what they would really do, and that's why, the other parts of the survey can help us show people's actual behavior with respect to these things. We also asked, how satisfied are you with your with how your neighborhood is designed for making bike riding safe? And these are just the overall results. So about 30%, almost 30%, were dissatisfied, and about 70% were satisfied. So that's just overall. We also asked about riding on trails. So we asked, in the past year, have you ridden on an off-street path in the area, such as the Spring Water Corridor Trail, to sort of give them an example? 54% of the cyclists had ridden on an off-street path in the past year. Of those, 37% of them always drove. Every time that they went, they drove to the trail. So those are people, and the reason we ask these questions, if our whole research is interested in how does your neighborhood affect the cycling that you're doing, and all the cycling that you're doing is somewhere else outside of your neighborhood, we sort of have to look at those people differently. I mean, they may be cycling a lot. I mean, they could be cycling 100 miles a week, but maybe none of it is going on in their neighborhood. So we needed to get at that. 52% of them never drove, though. Every time that they went to the trail, they, I assume, rode their bike there. I guess they could have taken transit. We didn't actually specifically ask. We just asked if they... Well, maybe, actually, we did. I'm sorry. That the drove would have included if they got on TriMet to get there. We didn't. We lumped those two together. And then a few more bits of info to throw in here. 2% of our cyclists had been in a collision with or said that they had been in a collision with a motor vehicle in the past 2 years. That was only 8 people overall, so we can't say a whole lot about those collisions. And then 21% of the cyclists said that they're riding more often than last year, but 34% said they're riding less often, and 45% said about the same. And that's just some, tidbits of information. So based on, this sort of first cut analysis, some preliminary conclusions and some things that we're definitely going to look into more and want to explore further. There seemed to be, there were some patterns there where there were some differences between that set of categories of being a regular cyclist. They seem to be a little different than the people that we categorized as utilitarian cyclists. Different in terms of attitudes, but also different in terms of how the neighborhood might be affecting their levels of cycling. So this is something that we definitely want to work on, trying to distinguish types of cycling that's going on and what is the influence of the environment. Some preliminary indications that there could be a really important role for these low traffic connected neighborhood streets as a cycling network. Because there's certainly in people's perception of the environment, there seemed to be a link to their cycling, the street connectivity pointing in that direction. We definitely need to do some more work here and come up with various ways of sort of measuring the quality of the cycling network. And one thing I'm speculating about is, certainly when you look at a map of where the bike lanes are, there's certainly a lot of areas in like inner southeast Portland where there aren't necessarily a high density of bike lanes, but there's certainly a nice network of connected low volume streets that could be influencing decisions. And so I think in particular because of that bike lane variable not being correlated with cycling rates, definitely want to develop some additional measures of the environment, ways of measuring the bike network to see what it might be influencing, or if there's different effects in different parts of the region, for example. And as I think I've repeated maybe too many times, there's still a lot of work to do analyzing this data. I mean, it's fun to do a survey like this, to collect all this data, and then it can sometimes be a little overwhelming to, now that I have the data, to do everything with it. But hopefully it should be fun as well. The survey is sort of the first part of this research project. The second part of the project that some of you may have heard about, because there was a little Oregonian story about it about 2 weeks ago, and that has sort of made the electronically has traveled all over the place. The next phase is to use GPS units to actually track and to see where people really do bicycle and how often they do. And so what we're going to be doing is we're recruiting. We're going to ask people from that first phone survey, but also we're going to be recruiting people to take this. It's a PDA with a GPS device in it, on their bicycle with them for about 10 days or so, everywhere that they bicycle. And what it will do is it will track where they cycled. And so then we can start looking at questions such as, what routes are they choosing to cycle on? Are they going out of their way to cycle on a low-volume street or a street with a bike lane or on a trail, or are they not? Are they just going the shortest, fastest route? How does that relate to their neighborhood or their age or all those other types of factors? Also, we can get better data on things like how fast they're going. Are they going uphill or downhill? And then you can start estimating their energy expenditure and the health benefits of their cycling. And that, again, if you remember Robert Wood Johnson, those are the types of things that they are interested in. So this is just one example of a bike trip that a potential respondent might be taking, and the data that we can get from this GPS device. So that's the phase that we're starting on now that will take place over the next 6 months or so. And then I'll have even more data to analyze. If you're interested in participating, if you want to add your name to the 300, Dana, my other research assistant, is saying no because she's dealing with the email, but I knew people were going to ask me, so I put it up here anyway. You can send an email to bikegps@pdx.edu. What we're going to be doing is, because as a result of that little Oregonian article that, it ended up on the bike blogs almost, within minutes of it showing up on the Oregonian website. We've gotten over 300 emails from people who say, I want to participate. My hunch is that of those 300, about 250 of them are really gung-ho, everyday cyclists. And I definitely want some of those, but in this sample, we want a range of people. We want people who are only cycling on the Springwater Corridor Trail. We want a real range. So what we're going to be doing with those 300, and I'm sure it'll be growing, and that's what Dana is like about, we're going to be having them do sort of a screening survey, so then we can select from those people to try to get a range, both geographic range, age range, income range, but also type of cyclists, because we don't want a bunch of 18 to 34-year-old young men who bike every day. We don't want to just sample them. So, and then there's my website where I'll be eventually posting sort of more results and updates. And with that, I can open it up to questions. But I'm going to take a drink of water first. Okay, in the back, and I forgot.
One of your maps showed a lack of utilitarian bike use in that one area. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, does topography have to do with that? Is that up in the West Hills?
Oh, yeah, topography.
Because I know the east side, it's really easy to do the grid, but on the west side.
And we are. We're working on sort of slope calculations. Well, it's not West Hills really. It's hilly. It's hilly, but yeah. So southwest. So topography is definitely one of the variables that we're going to be looking at. And again, that's where it gets difficult, because when you think about it, well-connected grid is also correlated with flat. And, curvy streets that are unconnected is also correlated with slope. And so that's where it gets sort of difficult to disentangle some of those things, but we're going to try. Oh, I forgot. I'm surprised one of my colleagues didn't. I forgot to remind everyone to use the microphones because you remember when you ask a question, because we are webcasting, to use the microphone in front of you and keep the red light lit while you're asking the question so the people on the web can hear the question.
So did you look up at the maximum distances for which the bicycle?
We have not yet, but because for the cyclists who gave us information, like on their most 3 recent trips, we have a start and an end point. So we will be able to look also at how far they bicycled, but so far we haven't looked at that yet. Here.
Yes, I guess. I'm really interested in this distinction that you make between utilitarian and regular cyclists. Did you ask people how long they have been engaging in a particular pattern of behavior? In other words, did you distinguish between whether it is a stable pattern of behavior, whether they're experienced or novice cyclists, really is what I'm getting at?
No, we're asking them about their behavior sort of in the past year, so we didn't. There's sort of trade-offs. If you could get a person to spend a whole hour on the phone with you, we could have added more questions like that. But that was one thing that we sort of sacrificed. We had to limit ourselves somehow.
Well, there's a reason why I say that, because I'm currently doing a cohort study of novice bicyclists. Mm-hmm. And the things that you are talking about with utilitarian cyclists are also, seems to be, I'm hearing them over and over from the novice cyclists in my group. They would do things, it seems like for novice cyclists, there's this extended period of experimentation and problem solving, finding a route, getting the right equipment, and so forth. So they start out, they're riding around their neighborhood. And when they start out, it's also, they have a heightened visibility of cyclists because they're starting to think about this themselves. So they pay more attention to the fact that they see cyclists. Also, you mentioned more likely to express negative opinions about cars. That is also something I would see as characteristic of a novice cyclist. Not so much that they have negative opinions about cars, but that whatever their previous mode of transportation is, there's some reason they were unhappy about it. And that is, in fact, contributing to the fact that they're starting to think about riding a bike. So it might be a negative attitude toward a car, but if you're talking about somebody who had previously been riding TriMet, you might find that they had a negative, certain things they didn't like about TriMet, and that's why they were starting to ride.
We asked them about, I like transit was another question on there, and I don't think there were much differences. In fact, I think the cyclists liked transit more. There seemed to be more of a, environmental, progressive sort of thing going on there. But I am sort of curious, when you said that sort of those attitudes that they might not like cars and that there's a correlation with being a novice cyclist, are you also implying that as they become a more experienced cyclist that those attitudes would change?
No, what I'm suggesting is whatever their previous mode of transportation was, that is what is going to be their reference.
Yeah.
So
I would say, though, the vast majority of people in our sample are not a single mode people. That most of the cyclists that we talk to on the phone, they have cars. They're also driving. It's not like that's their only mode and how they're only getting around. There's probably a few people like that in our sample, but not a huge percent. Let's see, in the back there.
I was wondering, do you think there's another survey method that may better represent the younger riders that you said you couldn't get a hold of because they don't have a landline or something?
Yeah, that's a problem that all phone survey people out there are grappling with. It's getting worse and worse. Now, you could try to employ sort of a mix of methods, maybe trying to do something over the internet. I mean, the thing, though, is that you're trying to get a random sample. Like if I had, and there's other cycling studies out there where basically they have a website and they send out emails and say, go answer this. And you're going to have a problem with self-selection. You're going to have all the gung-ho cyclists going and filling out that survey. And so it's a challenge. And right now the technique is, well, the responses that you do get from those younger people, weight them higher to try to figure out your overall. What I do think, though, is all those 300 people that emailed us, I'm going to guess that there's a lot of younger people in there. And we're going to have them do the same survey, but online. And so we'll get some data there. And so then maybe we can see what we missed. But again, those are definitely self-selected. Let's see, right here.
When you're discussing there being bike lanes, do you ever break that down further into the quality of the bike lane? For example, to me, the speed of the traffic that I'm adjacent to. Or I have seen bike maps that show that there's a bike lane, for example, on Beaverton Hillsdale Highway, and I would never try to actually ride on the pavement through a lot of those areas.
Yeah. We haven't done that yet, and that's, again, sort of the next step in the analysis, is trying to come up with a better measure of the quality. Because if you look at the bike lane network, particularly on the west side, there's bike lanes on a lot of high volume arterials, because when they were built they put in a bike lane. And that isn't necessarily a great cycling environment, but it also really depends on the type of cyclist. So that's sort of the next step, is to look at that as well. Okay, I'm trying to think. Let me do this systematically. So let's finish up this row here. Yes.
In order to provide a safer and more comfortable way of bicycling, especially for older people who are not cyclists at all, did anyone say if only I had a 3-wheel bicycle or something, so it provides more balance? It's safer. For example, someone wants to just go to the supermarket to buy something or visit someone in the neighborhood. Instead of taking the car, he can just take the bicycle, especially in places where there is too much traffic. So having a 3-wheel bicycle provides balance, so not to fall down in slippery roads. It's less probability to fall down. So is this something doable?
That's a good idea. We did not ask that. And again, it sort of gets back to, and when I was designing the survey, I was really struggling. I didn't think of that question, but I sure thought of a lot of other questions that didn't get in the survey, because I had to keep going back to my original research questions. So my focus is on the physical environment and how's that influencing. And so I had to sort of limit questions that weren't related. But I think that's a really interesting idea. And can put it on the list for future research, particularly for older population, which is growing. So, what specific things might we do to get more of them cycling? Aaron?
I was just wondering if, in your questions regarding the utilitarian cycling, if you addressed the possibility of people combining cycling and transit trips. I guess I'm wondering if somebody might ride 1.5 miles to transit and then the rest of the way downtown, if they would have answered yes or no on those.
When we asked them specifically about the trips, like when we asked them about those 3 trips, on that we did ask them if transit was involved in that. I'm not finding the exact question. So we're going to have a little bit of data on that. And then when we do the GPS, if they take their bike on transit, we have a little thing for them to check when that's going on. So hopefully we'll collect some more data to see how much of that might be going on. Leslie.
Well, someone already mentioned the challenge of trying to reach the younger people, but I'm just wondering why did you decide to use a phone survey versus maybe randomly sending out a paper survey?
I debated. I originally intended to do mail, and then I switched to phone. I thought the response rate might be higher on the phone survey. And it was also a little quicker, and in this case, maybe a little less expensive. The other thing, sampling was easier on the phone survey because it's easy to get a list of phone numbers, and the survey research lab would already have it. It was going to be more expensive to sort of get the random addresses, but I'd probably, I mean, I guess the question is, those 18 to 24-year-olds who are cell phone only, are they going to fill out a paper survey? I mean, yeah, I guess there's maybe a higher chance that it would have arrived at their mailbox, but I don't know if they'd. So, Jim.
Another problem that pollsters and survey people are having is the increasing non-response rate. People who just say, "I'm not talking to anybody on the phone." What did you experience there, and was there any?
Yeah, you know what? I should have double checked on. I have my response rate somewhere, and I was trying to. I thought I had. I don't have it at my finger. Okay, let's see. 23% of the eligible phone numbers, those 566 people that completed it was 23% of what we call the eligible phone numbers. So those were the phone numbers that were, not a business and that they reached. So about 23%. So I'm pretty happy with that.
What differences have you seen between U.S. and European bike surveys?
Oh, well, you mean in terms of the findings, or? Well, it sort of depends actually where in Europe. But the European countries where you see really high rates of cycling, like the Netherlands and other places like that, the demographics are a lot different. You see old people cycling, you see women cycling, you see all ages cycling, you see people cycling for all purposes. It's not, what? Yeah, so it's much different in terms of demographics, and certainly the amount of cycling going on. I mean, though that's not universal. I mean, there's certainly plenty of places in Europe where cycling rates are just as low as they are in the U.S. in big cities, but there's those standout areas where it's a lot higher.
I was surprised by the finding about higher income correlating with more cycling, because it's also correlated with more driving, higher income. Mm-hmm. So can you speak to that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. And like I said, it was this conference that I was at, there were at least 2 other papers I saw that found some similar things. And so I think one of the things that we want to dig into is trying to separate out the people who are only cycling for exercise and recreation, like mountain biking and, going out on trails and doing a long, and who are only doing that versus the people who are using the bicycle for their transportation. And I think that's though I haven't dug through the numbers enough yet, but I'm thinking that's explaining part of it, because that's sort of not to stereotype too much, but it's a bit of a higher income sort of sport or hobby to, be like Lance Armstrong or whatever, to, have the $1,000 or $2,000 road bike or mountain bike that you're out there using. So I'm thinking a little bit of it is coming from that. But also, I think, and this is again, I'm speculating, but when you think about the city of Portland and you think about bike commuters, there's a lot of higher income people who are bike commuters because it's part of their lifestyle. It's some of that's coming from their attitudes of being environmentalists and wanting to cut down on pollution and that type of thing, and some of it's for health reasons, and they live in those inner neighborhoods that have great houses, and in a lot of those places you have to have a higher income, and so it's probably a combination of some of that, but that's just me speculating. Remember to use the microphone.
I have essentially 2 questions. First of all, is there bicycle-related accident information or data that you could use?
There is some data, and I'm looking at Chris, because we're going to be starting a project soon looking at particularly pedestrian crash data. It's not great, though. They collect data, particularly when people die. There's data on that. What there is not data on is, when there's no police reports or things like that. I mean, there's a lot of bicycle crashes and things going on that don't get reported anywhere. So that's really hard, but to get.
It seems like the worst ones would be reported, and those would, be signals to, where maybe in the bike lane network or, bike
Yeah,
route
the only
network
thing is that
would be hot
there
spots.
aren't very many of them, and so there often aren't enough bicycling ones to really pinpoint any hot spots, because even though this is a city that has a pretty high rate of bicycling compared to other large cities, and now I am just talking city of Portland, it's still a very, very small fraction of all the travel, and then only a small fraction of those cyclists are getting involved in some sort of a crash that would be reported. And so it's hard to use that data. And then you can even see that only 2% of our cyclists, I mean, that, I don't know, that's a judgment call, I guess, whether that's a big number or not. But it certainly isn't enough. If we ask those 8 people like where it took place or something like that, we still don't have enough data to really to say anything about the problems. So.
There was another part, more technical, with your data. In order to compare it more with the network, have you thought about doing some inverse distance weighting or cluster analysis to be able to turn the data more into a surface?
Yeah, I mean that's those are definitely some of the next techniques we'll be looking into, and some different spatial statistics that we can use, and we'll definitely be doing some multivariate modeling and all sorts of other things. Yeah.
My question actually kind of takes a step past his, and that was, I was wondering if one of the factors that you looked at or thought about looking at affecting bicycling demand was attitudes towards law enforcement pertaining to the person's mode. Like, I mean, if somebody thought that they would like to bicycle, but they didn't feel like, for instance, if they got in an accident, they would get a fair shake with the police, or if a driver actually the other way around thought that bicyclists were getting away with murder, or whatever, how that sort of influenced, bicycling demand.
Didn't have anything on the survey that would even be close to getting at that. And I don't think I've seen any other research that's tried to get at that. There's a lot of interest now, and I think we'll start maybe to see some interest in aggressive driving and effects of aggressive driving on cycling or walking or other things as well. And that starts to get at some law enforcement issues as well. But no. Chris.
City of Calgary in
Wow.
Canada. So,
Hey.
What do you think is the relationship between an increase in gasoline prices and cycling rates?
Oh. There's nothing in my data that gets at that. So I couldn't say based on this survey what the relationship would be. And I skipped that session at TRB that was talking about gas price. I mean, in general, we don't see much of a relationship between gas prices and travel behavior when we're talking about pretty small increases. But I couldn't say anything. Sorry, Calgary. I wish I had something more to tell you.
I was wondering if there's any way to connect the availability of housing with commuting or utilitarian, to where maybe. So I was wondering about if people can afford to live closer, therefore they can cycle more.
Well, let's see. So are you thinking about policy, or am I?
I was wondering about position with how much people made, where they lived, and where they actually were trying to get to.
Oh, where they're trying to get to. I'm not sure if we'll be able to do that with this data, though we will be looking at, one thing that we haven't done yet is look at the mix of land uses in their neighborhood. So do they live in an all residential area, or do they live in a place where there are shops or something that they could bicycle to nearby, and to see if that's having an influence, particularly on utilitarian cycling. But I think you do bring up a good, sort of a larger planning issue of sort of equity, and are we only these lively mixed-use neighborhoods that are very attractive and allow people to use lots of different modes in a safe way? are those environments providing places for people of all incomes, which I think is a bigger, important question that we need to be asking, not just for cycling, but everything. Was there, let's see, yeah.
Yeah, when your analysis is complete, do you think you'll have any sense of whether or not people are locating to certain places, I mean, making home choices based on the availability of, safe bike routes?
We asked a question specifically on that, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull. The share of people, we said like how important was the cycling environment in choosing your home. And I'm not finding, I was surprised. It wasn't a very big, it was a pretty small percent that said it was an important factor. I think there's definitely a lot more research, though, and we've been talking about this amongst the faculty here in urban studies and planning, sort of bigger questions of the role of livability and things like bicycling and walking in lively neighborhoods, the role of all those factors in people deciding to move to the Portland region and trying to quantify that somehow. But so far, the only thing with this survey, though, is I didn't, again, with the limits, I only asked them how important the bicycle environment, so I can't judge relative to other factors how important it was. So it's just sort of a first step. Or Matt.
Did you, in your data, talk about attitudes about cycling and income? Just one of these other questions. Like this notion of like maybe if I'm at a low income level, cycling would maybe be, I don't want to cycle. It'll be like
yeah. I haven't looked at that yet, but we definitely can and will. I mean, we can take all those attitude factors and show how they might relate to income and see if that's going on. I think that'll be interesting. So you'll see me again here with the next phase of results.
Especially regarding utilitarian use, did you include any questions about a safe place to leave your bike? For example, if you ride your bike to a shop, do you feel safe leaving it there, or to work, is there a place to leave it?
Yeah, we didn't. And I feel like, oh my, you guys are coming up with all these great questions. This was the survey instrument, and I've even printed this as 2 pages per page. And I mean, it was a very lengthy. Some people were on the phone with us for 45 minutes, so which is excessive for a phone survey. And even the people who didn't cycle were on the phone with us for like 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And so I was already pushing already quite a bit in terms of the limits of asking them stuff. Use the mic. Yep.
You were talking about adjusting your sample to meet the census population. Were you thinking of maybe meeting the geographic distribution and the densities of the internally? Because I think that may get you into sort of higher density. May also be more people maybe in areas where you have more bicycle density of facilities.
Yeah.
In which case you may be overrepresenting areas
well,
that don't have the bicycle.
The thing about, I mean, the reason you want to, one main reason you want to sort of weight the sample to reflect is if you want to say things about the population as a whole. If I wanted to say in the Portland region what share of the people are regular cyclists, I definitely need to take that into account. But once I get into starting asking questions of, does the bike network affect the levels of cycling, it's not quite as important as long as I have enough people in the range of cycling networks. If I have enough people who are in really nice, good cycling areas and bad and in between, I don't know if I'm as concerned about sort of weighting spatially. But I'll consult some more experts on that to see if I would want to.
You had just a little thing on people who were riding on trails and then how they got to the trail. Did you, by any chance, probe questions of who they were traveling on the trail with. For example, I will ride to a trail with a fellow adult. If my children are along, I may be more inclined to drive to the trailhead. And it also depends on whether children are young enough that they're still in a trailer or on a tag-along, so I know where they are and have control of where they are.
Yeah. On that question in particular, the trail, we did not. But when we asked them about the specific bike trips that they took, we did ask them if other people were riding with them and how many of those people were under the age of 18. So for the trip data, we'll be able to do that. And then for our GPS, on the GPS thing, what we're doing is after we get the data of all their trips, then we create those cool maps that showed where they went. And then they'll do an online survey where they look at that and then they answer some questions. And one of the questions we're going to have them answer is, was anyone else with you? Were you pulling a trailer? Did you have a kid on your bike with you? Did you have a kid? So we'll get some of that information because as we discovered in some of our pre-testing, that does influence people's decisions. You know, having a kid in a trailer is going to affect where you ride versus not having that.
You do any breakdown within utilitarian cyclists between people who commute to work and people who go to the store, and any differences that came out there?
We haven't done that yet, so that'll be one thing. I feel bad. I haven't done that yet. I've answered that a lot. I mean, I have a lot of stuff, and there's still a lot more to do, and that's definitely one thing that we'll be doing. And this is good. These questions are good for me, too, to get ideas of the additional analysis that we should be doing. Any additional questions?
Well, before we...
Okay.
Next week we have Professor Donald Shoup from UCLA talking about the high cost of free parking. So
that's going to be a packed room. I'm going to guarantee you. So if you're coming in person, get here early.
Jennifer.
Okay.